Anastasia Grace N, and I am a student of English Literature from Jakarta State University. Today, we would like to analyze The Telltale Heart, which is wrote by Edgar Allan Poe, using Roland Barthes' theory, especially on structuralism. Short story is a branch of literary work which is brief and not as complicated as novel, so it can be done in a few moments. That is why most of people once read at least a short story in their life. Even though there are many people who enjoy to read short story, they are not aware of the 5 codes of Roland Barthes' theory. Unlike the rules, these codes are mostly like the perspective from which people view the short story. Even it is short, we choose the short story of Edgar Allan Poe entitled The Telltale Heart because it is enigmatic for the readers. Now, we move to the perspective of structuralism. So, structuralism is an intellectual movement which began in France in 1950s and is the first step in the work of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Maybe some of you already know about theorists, especially in semiotics field, and the literary critic Roland Barthes, who will be discussed more by the next presenter. This criticism theory was important into Britain mainly in the 1970s and attained widespread influence and even notoriety throughout the 1980s. We use the perspective of Roland Barthes, who applied the structuralist method to the general field of modern culture on analyzing the telltale heart. Now, we would like to talk about the background of our analysis. We use this theory because it is more structured and objective than other theories. We compare the 5 theories: moral, autobiographical, new criticism, reader response, and structuralism, with the some aspects. They are moral values, author, the text itself, the readers, and language. We choose to analyze the telltale heart because it has multiple meanings behind the text from different perspectives based on 5 codes of Roland Barthes' theory. In this analysis, we use descriptive analysis. It's the term given to the analysis of data that helps describe, show, or summarize data in a meaningful way. For example, patterns might emerge from the data. The structuralist critics do analyze mainly prose narratives relating to the text to some larger containing structure. Interpret literature in terms of a range of underlying parallels with the structures of language as described by modern linguistics. Apply the concept of systematic patterning and structuring to the whole field of Western culture and across cultures, treating the system of science, anything from ancient Greek myths to brands of soap powder. We try to follow a few steps by Barthes. The text was examined the story carefully to identify its embedded suspense, enigmas, symbols, binary polarities, and cultural references that are 5 elements of Barthes' theory.
The Telltale Heart is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, first published in 1843. It follows an unnamed narrator who insists on his sanity after murdering an old man with a vulture eye. The murder is carefully calculated, and the murderer hides the body by cutting it into pieces and hiding it under the floorboards. Ultimately, the narrator's guilt manifests itself in hallucination that the man's heart is still beating under the floorboards. It is unclear what relationship, if any, the old man and his murderer share. It has been suggested that the old man is a a father figure, or perhaps that his vulture eye represents some sort of veiled secret. The ambiguity and lack of details about the two main characters stand in stark contrast to the specific plot details leading up to the murder. The story was first published in James Russell Lowell's The Pioneer in January 1843. The Telltale Heart is widely considered a classic of Gothic fiction genre and one of Poe's most famous short stories. It has been adapted and served as an inspiration for a variety of media. The setting in this story is in a house. We don't know where the narrator is while he's telling the story of the old man's murder. The story he tells us takes place inside a random old house about which few details are directly given. Who is the narrator? Can she or he read minds? And more importantly, can we trust her or him? Well, the point of view of this story is the first person, central narrator. Most Poe narrators are unreliable. First person narrators. This doesn't necessarily mean they don't show up when they say they will, but rather that they either can't or won't tell us what really happened. The genre itself is horror, or Gothic fiction, of course. This genre is one of the easy genre to spot and also one of the most fun to explore, as long as you don't mind looking at the hard stuff. Snapped minds, crypt-like spaces, actual crypts, death and dismemberment, fear, the extremes of human behavior, a chest position, and the sacred and the profane. These are some of sure signs you are in a Gothic story, or at least a Gothic moment. The story also has a tone. The tone is dreadfully nervous and sad, while some Poe stories have a kind of fun, playful feel to them in spite of their things or death, murder and betrayal. Telltale makes us want to cry. The narrator is so pathetic and, as we suggest in his correct analysis, probably physically ill. The narrator seems to have had a pretty bad life, which probably only gets worse after the murder and the subsequent confession. And also this story has a running style. Concisely chaotic, stylistically, Poe can be quite meandering, even as we marvel at the precision and the tightly packed, increasingly worded yet gracefully rough sentences, each open to hours of debate. More accurately, it could be described as an approach in academic disciplines in general that explores the relationships between fundamental principal elements in language, literature, and other fields upon which some higher mental, linguistic, social, or cultural structures and structural networks are built. Through this network, meaning is produced with a particular person, system, or culture. This meaning then frames and motivates the action of individuals and groups. In its most recent manifestation, structuralism as a field of academic interest began around 1958 and peaked in the late of 1960s and early 1970s. Structuralism appeared in academia for the first time in the 19th century and then reappeared in the second half of the 20th century, when it grew to become one of the most popular approaches in academia fields concerned with the analysis of language, culture, and society. The work of Ferdinand de Saussure concerning linguistics is generally considered to be a starting point of 20th century structuralism. The term structuralism itself reappeared in the words of French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and gave rise in French to be the Structuralist movement. Almost all members of this so-called movement denied that they were part of it. Structuralism is closely related to semiotics. Post-structuralism attempts to distinguish itself from the use of the structural method. Deconstruction was an attempt to break with structuralistic thought. Some intellectuals like Julia Kristeva, for example, took structuralism and Russian formalism as a starting point to later become prominent as structuralists. Structuralism has had varying degrees of influence in social sciences, a great deal in the field of sociology, but hardly any in economics. Now we move to the structuralism in literary theory and literary criticism. In literary theory, structuralism is an approach to analyzing the narrative material by examining the underlying variant structure. For example, a literary critic applying a structuralist literary theory might say that the authors of the West Side Story did not write anything really new, because their work has the same structure as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. In both facts, a girl and a boy fall in love. A formula with a symbolic operator between them would be boy and girl, despite the fact that they belong to two groups that hate each other, boys groups and girls group, or opposing forces, and conflict in the result by their death. Structuralistic literary criticism argues that the novelty value of a literary text can lie only in new structure, rather than in the specifics of character development and voice in which that structure is expressed. Now we move to the Semiotic and Myths by Roland Barthes. Barthes' many monthly contributions collected in his mythologies frequently interrogated specific cultural materials in order to expose how British society asserted its values through them. For example, the portrayal of wine in French society as a robust and healthy habit is a British ideal that is contradicted by certain realities. He found semiotics, the study of science, useful in these interrogations. Barthes explained that these British cultural myths were second-order signs or connotations. A picture of a full dark bottle is a signifier and that relates to a specific signified, a fermented alcoholic beverage, of course. However, the British see relate to a new signified, the idea of healthy, robust, relaxing experience. Motivations for such manipulations vary from a desire to sell products to a simple desire to maintain the status quo. These insights brought Barthes in line with similar Marxist theory. Barthes used the term myth while analyzing the popular consumer culture of post-war French in order to reveal that objects were organized into meaningful relationships via narratives that express collective culture values.
And now, we use the 5 quotes by Roland Barthes to analyze the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. The first quote is pro-arietic quote. The readers focus on an action and specific of their reactions. The pro-arietic quote is also called the code of actions. It refers to those elements that create suspense in the text and catches the interest of the reader. Every action of suspense heralds was constant. What happens next? In this way, it keeps the interest of the readers alive for the coming actions. And on the text, like when the narrator sneaked into the old man's room, when the narrator murdered the old man, and when the narrator compares to the camera. And the second quote is the hermeneutic quote. This quote poses questions or arguments which provide narrative suspense. The hermeneutic quote is also called the enigmatic quote. It refers to those elements of a text that are mysterious, puzzling, and unexplained or incompletely explained
in the narrative text, and so make the reader curious to know or understand them. The reader tries to unveil the mystery of these elements by raising different questions, like what does the title mean? What does lifestyle that the narrator have? Why the narrator murdered the old man? And the third one is the semantic code. This code is also called the connotative code. It is linked to the theme. The semantic code is also called the connotative code. This code refers to those elements that give some additional meaning or connotative meaning. The connotative meaning is often found in the characterizations, like the meaning of the future eye or the heart. And the fourth code is the symbolic code. This code is also linked to the theme, but on a large scale. It consists of contrasts and pairings related to the most basic binary polarities. The fourth code is also termed as the authentic code. The code is somehow like the semantic code, but its function is deeper than the later one. It refers to those elements that give opposite meanings. And the concept of polarities or binary opposition is central to the theory of structuralism. Like the narrator loved the old man, but finally he murdered him. And the last code is the cultural code. This code contains references out beyond the text to what is gathered as common knowledge. By this code, a reader gets the physical, physiological, medical, psychological, literary, and historical knowledge. The economic code is one of the cultural codes and refers to those cultural codes that are tied to cliches, proverbs, or popular sayings of various sorts. Like, the time when there was a lantern in the story shows that there was no electricity, like past time. So, based on the 5 codes that we used, it can be concluded that the applications of the 5 codes on the selected story disclose it into 5 different voices. The codes help the reader to understand the theme in new dimension. Here, the poetic and hermeneutic elements work together and develop the plot. But its function is deeper than the later one. It refers to those elements that give opposite meanings. And the concept of polarities or binary opposition is central to the theory of structuralism. Like, the narrator loved the old man, but finally he murdered him. And the last code is the cultural code. This code contains references out beyond the text to what is gathered as common knowledge. By this code, a reader gets the physical, physiological, medical, psychological, literary, and historical knowledge. The economic code is one of the cultural codes and refers to those cultural codes that are tied to cliches, proverbs, or popular sayings of various sorts. Like, the time when there was a lantern in the story shows that there was no electricity, like past time. So, based on the 5 codes that we used, it can be concluded that the applications of the 5 codes on the selected story disclose it into 5 different voices. The codes help the reader to understand the theme in a new dimension. Here, the poetic and hermeneutic elements work together and develop